Welcome to Talk Time with Tracy. Today, I have with me a special guest who I have known for a number of years and worked with through my role as president of the NAACP Unit 1134 Bremerton-Kitsap. I'm excited that we have this opportunity to follow up in conversation on where we ended in our forum last year after the George Floyd incident. So today, our former Bremerton Police Chief, I call him still Chief Steve, is going to tell you a little bit about himself before we get started. And I welcome him and his new role as an Executive Director of the County Sheriffs and Police Chiefs. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Tracy. I appreciate it. It's really good to be here. And as you mentioned briefly, you and I have known each other for many years. It's truly my honor to be asked back and to be here, and I look forward to it. As you mentioned, and some of your viewers may know this, but I was really privileged to serve as the Chief of Police in Bremerton. Still a Kitsap resident, by the way. It's the community that I am still proud to call my own. Served as the chief in Bremerton. Prior to that, was worked for the King County Sheriff's Office as the chief deputy and the appointed sheriff in King County. And prior to that, was the chief of police in Kent for 5 years. So quite a lot of experience here in the state of Washington. Originally from the Midwest, where I started as a police officer, and have been privileged to be in law enforcement for, almost 35 years now. And Tracy, you mentioned my new position. It's actually, time goes so fast. 3.5 years I have been here, over 3.5 years now, with the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs. The acronym we use is WASPC, and it's the statewide association of the 39 elected sheriffs, well over 200 police chiefs around the state. It includes our sovereign tribal partners with tribal policing, Department of Corrections, the State Patrol, the FBI. It's been around since 1963. And we run a number of programs in addition to doing legislative outreach and working with policy issues around the state. And I've been fortunate to do this for, as I mentioned, 3.5 years, and particularly at a time of significant change and significant challenges for law enforcement. And I have always welcomed the opportunity, particularly in my community, in the Kitsap County area, to talk about it. So thank you, Tracy.
So again, I am thankful for you being here today in conversation. And pretty much what I want to accomplish today is just to give a little bit better understanding of the changes that people have been hearing about in the community around House Bill 1054, but also just kind of, continuing the conversation that we began again last summer. Mm-hmm. And at that last summer forum, we had our police chiefs and sheriff, and you were present, and Derek Kilmer, and we talked about, accountability and how the community was feeling about chokeholds and particular restraints, the neck restraints, and how those are dealt with, and how does House Bill 1054 affect that now? Mm-hmm. Let's start there.
Sure, and thank you. And again, this is part of sort of an ongoing conversation that many of us have been having, including the two of us, in our roles in the community and in our roles in facilitating these conversations. And I'll go back just a little bit to mention that, even after the murder of George Floyd in 2020, in the intensifying conversations that many in our communities have been having around reform, around law enforcement, around certainly the larger issue of social justice, because I think that's an important one in terms of society, in terms of everything, not specifically law enforcement. I think it's important to note, because it's important, and I don't mean to say this like we're boasting. I do want to say this because I think it's important. WASPC, when our leaders, our board, which is made up of chiefs and sheriffs, the chief of the State Patrol, FBI, in January of 2019, so again, quite a long time ago, we issued a public statement that we called our Principles for Community Trust. And an important element of those principles that we posted on our website, we sent out a release, we wanted to make it very public, and it was passed by our board, passed by our membership, specifically said that we acknowledge institutional discrimination in many elements of society, including criminal justice. And we will play our part with stakeholders to effect change, to reduce those institutional levels of discrimination that impede success for all persons. And those weren't just words. That was something we wanted to make a very important point about. But we also made the point that exists in criminal justice. It exists in housing. It exists in finance. It exists in education. And how do we play a part in changing that? So then move forward to last spring, and all of the stresses of the pandemic, the economic shutdown, and all the things that people are feeling as a result of that. Then the murder of George Floyd, the follow-up, and again the intensifying conversations about that. And how do we move that forward in a productive way? We brought forward reforms that we recommended as part of our contribution to the conversation. It was not the entire conversation, but rather here's part of what we would like to see. The legislature passed a number of bills in the early part of 2021. We raised concerns and in some cases opposition to some of those bills for various reasons, which are well documented, and we're very transparent about it. And it brings us to your question, Tracy, which is we are now having a great deal of conversation, both within law enforcement and within communities about, you mentioned 1054, which is sometimes called the tactics bill. Mm-hmm. And one of the elements of that goes back to the previous conversation that we had months ago, long before these bills were passed, okay, about neck restraints, chokeholds, concerns within the community, yes, about their use, both locally and nationally. And I have certainly never, I'm not sure I've ever seen in my law enforcement career, which again goes back to the 1980s, a unified element of law enforcement saying that what they saw in Minneapolis was 100% wrong and unacceptable. I mean, I did not hear anybody saying, well, there's more to, I mean, that was like, no, that is wrong. It is tragic and horrifying, and it's wrong. And that led to a very robust conversation about neck restraints and chokeholds. And anyone who saw that would certainly have a strong opinion about it, as they should. So the bill, as it was passed, and one of the issues we brought up was if the legislature chooses, and it's certainly their prerogative, they're the legislature, they're the democratically elected representatives that we send to make laws. That's okay, that's their job.
That's correct, yes.
And if they choose to restrict those, so be it. There are departments who used something they called a lateral vascular neck restraint, which was used as a way to not ultimately become involved in deadly force. But again, I'm not here to defend or say that that's bad or good. That's a policy issue. It's a training issue. The issue is the legislature indicated in 1054, the tactics bill, that they wanted to prohibit the use of chokeholds, which is, I would call it a more generic term, somewhat different than neck restraint. It's important to note that if any person, including a police officer, is fighting for their lives, they have a right to defend themselves in any way that they see appropriate. And that's true of any person, again, not specific to law enforcement. And so it may seem like a difference, it doesn't make a difference, but there is a difference there where I think it is important to clarify that a person can use any force necessary. Any resident walking down the street can use any force necessary if they are fighting for their lives. And so some of the conversation going on around this has to do with sort of the difference between those two things. What the legislature is saying is, as a matter of course, as a tactic, we are prohibiting neck restraints and we are prohibiting chokeholds because of community concerns. And that's what the bill says. And so a lot of that conversation really is about, well, what about a person who is fighting for their lives? Could they potentially be disciplined or charged criminally. And I think what the legislature is starting to work through is well, in truly a life or death situation, that is different than a tactic that is trained and used as a procedure. So that's a really long explanation to the question, but hopefully that helps us to sort of understand that if the legislature again makes a decision about prohibiting a particular tactic or procedure, again, that's their prerogative. It hopefully does not lead to an increased use of deadly force because that option is no longer available. And that is one of the concerns that was raised.
And of course, we know that when legislation is in the process of being put forth and being voted on, there's lots of versions,
Yep.
Lots of stakeholders, and you have staff members that are working on things, and you're defining what is happening in the process. And when we think about chokeholds and neck restraints, when you see something like the George Floyd incident on TV, then it brings it to a level of at what point in time was enough enough. So then you get into less lethal alternatives. Were there any alternatives? So let's talk a little bit about when the options come forward to apply less lethal tactics, understanding now when you're talking about the use of limiting when you can use tear gas, with the chokeholds and the neck restraints. How will a taser, how will that come into play?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I think I'm trying to think the best way to sort of couch this. I think one of the unfortunate outcomes and a place where we find ourselves now is so many of the reforms, so many of those changes, many in law enforcement agree with and agreed with the goals of focusing on de-escalation, the focus of sanctity of human life as the center of what we should be viewing. Again, that's something that we have advocated for a very long time, and ensuring that it's also balanced with public safety. So in other words, it needs to be a balanced approach that respects that element of de-escalation, sanctity of human life, but also is clearly defined, clearly understandable, and is something that officers and deputies can work with. So going back to your question, the focus on de-escalation is something that, again, I think conceptually makes a lot of sense. Much of the concern that has been raised more recently since the passage of the laws and to now where they've actually gone into effect at the end of July, and some of the concern was raised by us, was about clarity and about ambiguities in the law. An example, there were three terms used, and I apologize, I don't have them in front of me, but there were three terms used about de-escalation in House Bill 1310, and I believe it was possible, available, and a third term that they're not clearly defined in law. And we're law enforcement sort of saying, well, what does that mean? Generally speaking, when laws are written, there's clearly defined definitions of what those things mean. And in our our constitutional court system, those are usually defined through case law. Well, case law happens in the future. And in addition, part of that bill also said that the Attorney General was responsible for issuing model policies to create some structure and to remove some of the ambiguity and confusion. But those model policies aren't due until a year from now. So we're in the here, but those are all about the future. At the same time, there was also a separate bill that creates a new framework for decertifying law enforcement officers if they are found to have violated some of the rules, particularly pertaining to use of force. So that all creates an element of when you have ambiguity, confusion, undefined terms, legal advisors providing information to departments that is sometimes varied, because if you ask 10 attorneys about their interpretation of 10 things, you may get up to 10 different opinions.
Correct.
And so each department is doing just that right now. And it's very complex. And so officers and deputies are trying to work their way through, okay, it's reform. This is what the legislature wants. this is what it's going to look like. There are so many questions that don't have answers.
Mhm.
There are stakeholders who are looking to ask for opinions from the Attorney General to
Yes.
hopefully provide some greater clarity, and we are among the groups that are advocating for that. We would like to see the model policies as soon as possible, because that would hopefully create some greater clarity as well. Again, they're not due legislatively until summer of 2022. And then, ultimately, I think there's some who have expressed, is there other things the legislature can do to provide some specificity? I go back to when I was a patrol officer, a long time ago, but I felt in my job like I understood what was expected. I knew what society wanted. I knew what my department wanted, and I felt relatively comfortable making decisions within that framework. And when that isn't there, that's a very difficult environment in which to work. At the same time, and I need to say it loud and clear, every department, every officer, every deputy, they want to, number one, they want to follow the law.
Right.
Number two, they want to respond to what the community wants. And, in our democratic rule of law, constitutional system, these decisions are made, and, everybody wants to follow them. And so many of these issues are really related to definitions, unintended consequences, ambiguities. And again, I will say too that those involved in writing the laws have said, there are things that need to be clarified. There are things that we need to work on and come back to.
Yes.
So among all of those problems, hopefully we can start to point toward let's get to a point where we can get those questions answered, so that we can balance reform with public safety, so that people know what's expected and the community feels that they know what their local department's going to do.
Yeah. So that will, and you mentioned 1310, and it does set out July of 2022 for the Attorney General to have their develop model policies, and then also I think then the other date is December 1st of 2022 for law enforcement agencies to adopt. So it's almost where we see it becoming effective, the end of July, to begin to not do what's limited as far as the lethal force with the chokeholds and the neck restraints, and then also restrictions regarding vehicle pursuits to only when there's when an officer has probable cause. And I think there was a recent hit and run. Maybe Snohomish County, I remember reading, and the conversation was that they couldn't pursue the vehicle.
Was this the wrong way driver that was going down?
Yeah, the one-way driver.
I heard about that one.
So in that instance, I guess I didn't quite understand why the opinion was if the person couldn't be pursued if they were driving the wrong way.
That's what everyone's working through. And I think I'm familiar with that case. And again, I wasn't there, so I don't know any more than any other consumer of the media knows on this one. But as I understand it, the 1054, again, the tactics bill, significantly restricts pursuits under the public policy initiative that the legislature is expressing. And again, their prerogative, that they really don't like pursuits because they're dangerous, and they are.
Right.
They are.
Yes.
Pursuits are dangerous. That's why almost every department I've ever heard of significantly limits them, and they only engage in a pursuit after a really, robust balance of is this necessary.
Yes.
Having said that, the legislature has restricted them much, much further. And the issue is a vehicle may be pursued under the new law. And again, this is a generalization subject to legal analysis by each individual department's legal advisor. Basically, they are restricted to very significant felony crimes, generally violent felony crimes, and some sex crimes that are felony crimes. But even in those cases, the pursuit may only begin if there is probable cause. Right. So not reasonable suspicion. It used to be reasonable suspicion, which was, I'm pretty sure that's the person, I need to check them out, to probable cause, a much higher level. Probable cause, at least to me, generally means I can charge this person. I have enough to potentially jail this person. That's a very high burden of proof. And we asked the legislature, are you sure you want it that high? That's really high. That will almost preclude pursuits. It's going to be very difficult to get to that level. And the legislature said, we acknowledge your concerns. We acknowledge that's a very high level for pursuits. This is a policy decision that they chose to make. They did provide a different level for basically drunk driving or impaired driving, which would require only reasonable suspicion, which is the same as it is now. Right. But remember, overlaid on top of that is still departments, often won't engage in a pursuit because of the level of danger and traffic and those kind of things. It also requires supervisory approval and a number of other elements in the new law. So let's go back to your example. I believe the vehicle was going, I think they hit a vehicle. I think they were going the wrong way down an off ramp of a freeway or something like that. Yes. They struck the vehicle head on. Apparently were not injured. They backed up and took off again. The troopers, the state troopers in that case, did not pursue. Their perception was this crime does not fit the violent crime and sex crimes that would be required with probable cause. Therefore, it is not allowed. And I think that is an accurate analysis.
I think that's correct as far as the state patrol said that they didn't respond.
Now there
but
are
I think my interpretation of the second component that you mentioned is that would have given with the one wrong way down the ramp, the hit, the accident happening, and then the fleeing for meeting the element of pursuit, or there's an interpretation there that I think that was missed, in my opinion.
Well, the question I think would be, do we want officers or troopers to assume that reckless or aggressive or dangerous driving is probably impaired? Because if it's impaired, then that would allow a pursuit for reasonable suspicion. But I've certainly arrested lots of drivers in my law enforcement career who were reckless and drove in crazy ways that weren't impaired at all. They were just driving that way. So what it's requiring, in effect, is for the trooper or officer to begin to make leaps of faith or judgments that a defense attorney or a decertifying entity would say, well, what exactly was it that led you to believe that they were impaired, so that reasonable suspicion was the burden for a pursuit? And if your answer is, well, they hit another car and they were driving recklessly, again, this is what's coming from legal advisors, is that's not a sign of impairment. You need to have weaving. You need to have some of those traditional indicators of drunk driving or impaired driving, and it has to be much more robust than what you have. So again, I don't think there's a bright line.
Right.
And you get back to the point that with the new laws in place, if a trooper chose to pursue, saying, well, they're probably impaired, so therefore I can pursue them. First of all, their supervisor has to agree, which is okay. And secondly, what if they're not? Then let's say that they're not impaired, and the pursuit begins, and then somebody uninvolved gets hurt. A motorist or a pedestrian is hurt or killed, and it turns out that person is not impaired. Then you have significant liability, and you also have significant possible decertification under, again, a different law that was just passed that says that if you violate these, it will be, now the Criminal Justice Training Commission can decertify you. So again, I'm not saying that was the wrong interpretation or the right interpretation, but all these things are playing at the same time, and every department's trying to work through that in conjunction with their individual legal advisors. And it goes back to, if we can hopefully find greater clarity about the goals as compared to the way the bills were written, I think that's going to ultimately be very helpful.
And yes, the interpretations can be different. And I guess but in the past, what in essence came out was the state troopers would have pursued. without there
Right.
being this change.
Correct.
And because the reasonable suspicion would have been this driver has to be impaired, whether it's getting into dementia, all time, some type of medical under the influence of drugs and alcohol, something there that would have caused this would have been a contributory factor
Right.
in this driver driving the wrong way on the ramp and then causing the accident versus driving conditions. In the winter, icy road, your car spins around and you end up on the wrong way on the on the off ramp. So so circumstances speaking to one set of conditions versus another set of conditions, and that factor, I guess.
Right.
How do we begin to address that, where the community is able to say, wow, if someone hits me, am I going to be able to get assistance or not get assistance?
Yeah. It's a great question. And you're exactly right, because as a member of the community, you look at that and you go, well, come on. I mean, this person was clearly presenting a danger to the public. But as I said, and I don't think it was an inaccurate, from far away. I wasn't involved in this, and I'm not involved certainly in providing legal advice to the State Patrol. But the former law, the way it used to be, and the way most departments' policies were written, had everything to do with safety of the public. Does the driving behavior of this person and what they're doing and what they're exhibiting create a greater danger to the public than a pursuit would provide to the greater, that's the balancing test. And that's what almost every department did. And so that was the previous system. The legislature, in writing very, very restrictive, very specific restrictions on pursuits, really only provided that reasonable suspicion allowance for pursuits specifically for impairment. And again, I don't know that you can make the assumption that a person driving recklessly is impaired. So I think it was, I might put this under the unintended consequence part of this law, which again, I think if you ask the authors, and I can't speak for any stakeholder,
any legislator,
but I think many legislators would say, okay, how do we get to a point where it is restricted as we expect? It is restricted, and it should be very, very rare and very exceptional for pursuits to occur. And again, it's within their purview. But, how do we make sure that incidents are handled in a way that doesn't cause the community to say, come on, in that case, that doesn't make sense. And when you write very complex and sometimes very restrictive new laws, again, these are some of the concerns that I think we raised both before and after they were passed.
So we've talked about some changes here and some unintended consequences. We aren't able to get to everything today. So I hope to have you back in conversation where we can talk about what's happened after a period of time has passed and the work that still needs to be done on this legislation. There's still things that need to be improved, clarified, and especially with the dates and deadlines that have been set within the legislation. So I'm so thankful to have you here with me, and I appreciate it. And thank you everyone for tuning in to another day of Talk Time with Tracy here on BKAT. Thank you.